Elementary music teacher friend, you love what you do, but you might feel unappreciated and, in fact, unseen some days. You may even feel like you're on a music teacher island and just want to connect with other music teachers who can relate to both your struggles and wins when it comes to teaching elementary music. I get you and understand completely the feelings you're having. That's why each and every week, the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast will provide you with solo and guest episodes that will help you realize you're not alone in your music teaching journey. Throughout each episode, my goal is for you to be able to walk away with actionable steps and ideas to help you feel like you're ready to take on the new week with whatever challenges may be thrown your way. Hi, I'm your host, Jessica Peresta, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're at home, in your car, in the shower, or wherever else you're listening, grab your cup of coffee or whatever other beverage is nearby and listen in to the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast.
I'm AJ Bianco from Podcast PD, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows in the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast. Today's episode is about how to teach elementary music without enough instruments. Every elementary music teacher is different. You may have a whole classroom set full of amazing instruments to use with your kiddos. Or you may find yourself in a situation where you have a few instruments and students can share and rotate, or however you like to set up that in your classroom. Or you may have no instruments. And that is where my story started as an elementary music teacher. I had one broken hand drum and didn't have a lot of instruments. I had none, actually. So I wanted to record an episode about this because I realized I never have. And to tell you that you can teach elementary music even if you don't have a lot of instruments at your disposal. So we're going to talk about how to do that, but also how to keep moving forward and teach music. And there is a blog post that goes right along with this episode you can find in the show notes, or just simply head to thedomesticmusician.com and click on the blog tab and it will be the top blog post. So it is tough to teach music without enough instruments. When you go through college, and this was my experience as well, and you are taught all the things you can do with students with instruments. Now, I also know if you are listening to this and you have a degree in music education, you have one class for elementary music methods. But during that one class, you learn about the different approaches in a quick way. You know, here's how you can do Orff and Kodály and Dalcroze, and super speedy version is what I'm getting at. But you're also taught about different instrument activities you can do with your students. I also know different practicums where you're going in and observing teachers, and during your internship and you're observing your cooperating teacher, you're constantly being shown different ways you can use instruments. I also know at workshops, it was like, hey, here's all these amazing drums lined up and mallet instruments and recorders. But then I remember feeling discouraged because I'm like, this is all amazing ideas and I will keep it in my back pocket for when and if. But right now in the moment, I don't have any of these instruments to use with my students. So maybe you're listening and you find yourself in that situation, or maybe you used to find yourself in that situation and now you're blessed with a lot of instruments. And either way, I really do feel like this episode will be helpful. And if anything, you listening to this and you have a lot of instruments, but you maybe know a music teacher friend who does not, I would love for you to share this episode with them because I know it's going to be helpful for, if anything else, encouraging them to keep moving forward, because I want you to know that you're not alone. And I know that you probably can relate to my story about seeing all these other amazing classrooms filled with all the things. And maybe you're, just looking at your blank white walls with barely anything. And I know it's hard to keep moving forward because a lot of times it's about mindset, and it's like, well, how can I teach music to my students if I don't have a lot of stuff? But the stuff is just stuff. First of all, and this goes back to many other episodes I've recorded, you are the music teacher. You are there to teach and encourage your students to learn music, even if you don't have stuff. Okay. We're going to get into that. So even though it's tough to teach elementary music without instruments, it's not impossible. It's not. It is frustrating. It can be discouraging at times, but it's not impossible. Sometimes it's about not what you don't have, but using what you do have. The instruments can be bought and built. Your classroom can be built up over time, and it's not going to be a magic fix and just happen right away. So just focusing on what you do have and moving forward is what's going to keep you from not being stuck. So we're going to focus on 4 key points today. And let's just go ahead and dive right in. The first point is, like I just said a minute ago, is use what you have. You may not have a lot of instruments, or any for that matter, but focus on what you do have. So first of all, this is a huge piece of advice I was given when I felt discouraged with no instruments in my classroom. I had an amazing teacher, actually, is my professor from college. I remember emailing him and being like, help me, please. If you've heard my story, I didn't really have a mentor teacher. So I relied on him a lot when he could help me. But I asked him, what do I do? How do I move forward with my students? I don't have instruments. And he said, I'll never forget this. And so I want to encourage you with this too. All of your students have voices and they have bodies. And so get them singing and get them moving. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know why, it just didn't click with me. Like, duh, like I was already doing those things, but he was just basically saying like, kiddos use what you have. And what do I have? I have my students. So we're going to create music by just being together and creating music with our voices and with our bodies, whether that's body percussion, movement activities, speech pieces, obviously singing. There was so much music, and there is so much music that can be taught by just doing that. So if nothing else, start there. Your students can do so many different movement activities. I mean, creative movement, formal movement activities, informal movement activities. I mean, there's like endless possibilities. You can do stories with them and have them move to that as well. Body percussion is amazing. It's something that I really got into because I had no other choice. And that's where body percussion became kind of a passion of mine, where when I know my students have their bodies, like we did so much stomping, and they can pat and clap and snap and move their bodies in such creative ways. You can even do a lot of body rondos, and it's really cool to see what the kiddos can come up with by just using their bodies. And so here's what to do. If you see a song that says use several different mallet and rhythm instruments, then instead of saying, well, I just can't do that song because I don't have the things. No, you're going to replace those things with body percussion parts. Okay. So for example, if a song is saying use, I don't know, 18 Tubano drums, maybe not that many, and you don't have any. So your kiddos' drums are going to be their laps. Okay. Or they can also pat the floor with their hands. They can, if it says to use some finger cymbals, well, they can snap their fingers instead. They can, in place of a tambourine, they can clap. So be creative with that. And kids love to use their imaginations. And so just tell them, you know what, we're going to pretend we're playing instruments, and this is what you guys are, the drum section. Just tell them what they're getting to do. And just, they understand. For kids, like they understand they don't have a lot of instruments in their classroom if that's where you find yourself. But they're not walking in with the mindset of, oh my gosh, I'm lacking. I really wish Miss Peresta's class had more instruments in here. I mean, there's going to be a couple kids that are like, why don't we have instruments in the music room? And just be honest with them and say, hey, you know what? That's my goal. But for right now, we're going to do so much amazing music together without instruments. And you're going to be so surprised how much we are able to do together. So use body percussion. Look for places in your lessons and in songs that you can replace instrument parts with body percussion. If you do have a few instruments, but not for the whole entire class, definitely use those. There's definitely ways you can incorporate instruments where the entire class doesn't have to have one. And we're going to talk about ways to do that. Point number 2 is get creative. I mean, you're already getting creative when you're having your students use their voices and their bodies. But if you have a few instruments for students to use, there are several ways to get creative in using them. So the first way is students can rotate parts. This is something I learned in ORF Level 1. If you've taken ORF Level 1, then maybe you did this and maybe you did not. But I, for the longest time, was always stuck on how do they do an instrument part but not get upset that their other kids aren't doing it? Or if they're not on the instrument part, how do I get my other students to not be upset about that? And when I learned about students rotating, oh my gosh, like it was really cool because kids knew every time they came into the music room, they weren't going to be all playing an instrument part. Sometimes we would have enough time to rotate through the different parts, but sometimes there just wasn't time. But what's cool is when you put all the different parts together where let's say 4 to 5 students are playing rhythm sticks, and then you have 4 to 5 students doing movement part to a song, 4 to 5 students are singing the song, and then maybe 4 to 5 students are doing some kind of body percussion activity to the song. When you put it all together, it sounds really cool, and you explain to your students that this is like putting on a performance. You're creating a performance together, and everybody in a performance doesn't do the same thing. All orchestra instruments, obviously, they're playing an instrument, but they're not all playing the same parts, but each part is needed. So that's the first thing, is have students rotate. It's your classroom, so just be really clear with your expectations and your procedures with your students, and explain to them where you can always have those kiddos that get upset if they don't get the part they want, but today you're not getting the part. Today you're not playing this part, but I'm going to next time. Maybe you put them in groups. Group 1 is always together. So maybe if group 1 got to play an instrument part that day, you just mark it on a piece of paper or wherever you keep notes for yourself to remember things, that group 1 doesn't get to do the instrument part next time because they did during this class period. So you're always going to try to make it fair as you can for your kiddos. But this is kind of a life lesson for students as well, to understand that they're not always going to get to do the part they want, and they're not always going to be able to play an instrument. It's a life lesson to learn where instruments is not the only thing that matters in here, right? I need your singing voices, and I really want you guys to be the singing voices today. I really need this really awesome movement part to happen. And then I really need, oh my gosh, this body percussion ostinato is awesome. So we're going to be putting that together as well. And then of course the instruments, but the instruments is not something that's going to happen every time we come in here. You may not even be doing instruments at all during that class period. So just explaining to students, like, it's a life lesson they can learn about. Sometimes you're just not going to get what you want, and that's okay, but we're all participating in music. It's a team effort. And so if you don't get the part you want, it's all right. We're going to move forward. Another creative way to do instruments in the music room is by using centers. If centers is new to you, I want to point you to podcast episode 170, where I go into detail about how to do centers, how I did it with my students before centers was even a thing. And then also there's a blog post that goes right along with that as well. If you, on my website, The Domestic Musician, just type in centers in the search bar that you can find at the bottom, or look at the link in the show notes in this podcast. But my best advice, I'm not going to dive into centers in detail in this episode, but I'm going to just give you a little bit of advice today. So my best advice is to have 4 to 6 stations or centers set up with different activities at each one. That way, students are going to be doing instruments when it's their turn at that center. There could be melodic instruments at a center, rhythmic instruments at a center, and different instructions at each. So basically, if you have 4 to 6 centers set up, you may have 1 or 2 instrument centers if you have instruments. So that's a great way too, because students know they're rotating through centers when they're in the music room. Sometimes they'll be at the instrument center and sometimes they won't, but they're all at some point going to be able to participate in that activity. The next point I want to talk about is instrument substitutes. So we've already talked about students have voices, they have bodies. So of course there's 100,000 things you can do with students singing and speech pieces and movement and body percussion. But there are things you can use to substitute in place of instruments until you are able to build up instruments in your classroom. So let's talk about bucket drumming first. Buckets, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's using buckets. It's a fantastic way to bring drumming to your students. If you go to your local hardware store, you will see those 5-gallon buckets. They're pretty inexpensive. Off the top of my head, I do not know the price, but they're pretty inexpensive. And I honestly know sometimes this happened to me with, I got a bunch of carpet samples once for free because they just were giving them away. And sometimes I've actually heard of music teachers getting some buckets for free. It's not just hardware stores, but look around. You never know where, like a Craigslist post or somewhere, Facebook Marketplace or wherever else, sometimes you'll see some random post where someone's like, hey, I have, whatever random item. And sometimes it's a bucket and I'm giving these away for free. It's sitting on the curb or whatever it might be. Like, you just keep your eyes open because you'll never know when those opportunities come up. But they also can be purchased at a local hardware store pretty inexpensively. And maybe you don't want to get a whole class set of them, but you just want enough to bring into your classroom where it comes for students to be able to rotate through or to use in centers in place of drums, then definitely 5-gallon buckets are perfect. Okay, so as for rhythm sticks, students can use non-sharpened pencils, and I'm being serious. I definitely did that, and it's amazing. And notice I said non-sharpened, okay? Buy a box of pencils. Give these to students to use as rhythm sticks. It's an amazing replacement for rhythm sticks, and I mean, let's be honest, you have pencils floating around your school building. And so use those in place of rhythm sticks. The students will think they're awesome. And you're also showing them, like, look, you can create music by using everyday items, even pencils. You can use them as rhythm sticks. If you have access to technology, there are amazing virtual xylophones and boom whackers and drums to explore as well. One of my favorite sites is called scratch.mit, and I'll link that in the podcast show notes as well. That one has a really cool virtual xylophone students can use and explore, and it sounds like a xylophone. And obviously, it's not the same as the real thing. They're not holding mallets, they're not able to remove the bars and get the experience of actually playing the instrument, but they're able to see the instrument on a computer and able to virtually play an instrument, which is also great for them to practice at home. And you can give a lot of instructions on how to use this with your students. Now, I know Scratch.mit is not the only one. Obviously, Music Play Online has amazing virtual instruments as well, and I've seen them at a lot of other websites too. So if you just type in, honestly, do a Google search for virtual xylophone or virtual drum or virtual boom whacker, you're going to see some amazing free options come up that you can definitely use with your students on a computer. Another option is to do a trade-off with a music teacher. This is something that is honestly really amazing and something I did. When I didn't have instruments, I had met some music teachers at workshops, and maybe there wasn't anything I could trade with them, but I would say, hey, do you have any instruments I can use and I can return them to you in a couple months? And a lot of them were like, sure, actually, yeah, I have this whole cabinet full of these little, the little xylophones, the old ones, the little red ones. I don't know if you remember what I'm talking about, but I was able to get some of those to use and then give them back to that music teacher. So just ask around. Don't be afraid to ask other music teachers. If you're in a school building where you don't have a lot at your disposal, just ask. And you never know, like, what's the worst they can say is no, but you never know. There's going to be a couple music teachers that are like, totally, I have some you can definitely use. But another thing is beg, borrow, steal, right? When thinking of how to substitute instruments, you can definitely think of how to borrow from a friend or think of something you could say, hey, if you let me borrow a few instruments, I have these really cool, I don't know, dry erase boards you could use for a while if you want. Or think of something else that they would really love to use in their classroom, and you can just trade and then set a date together where you get back together and trade back. So that's another option for getting some instruments and substituting those into your classroom. The last point before we go, I want to talk about is planning for the future. As a music teacher, I want to encourage you that the good news is each year gets better and easier when it comes to having instruments in your classroom. Although you may not have enough instruments right now, it doesn't mean you never will. When I started out, I had nothing. Then I got a grant from my school district 2 years after I started teaching. So I went 2 years without having any instruments. I finally got a teeny tiny budget. With that budget, I was able to purchase rhythm sticks. Then PTA finally decided after 4 years they were going to help purchase recorders for my classroom. So notice I said 4 years later. Yes, that was how long it took. So every year, though, you're going to just kind of make a plan about what you need. There are so many amazing grants you can apply for. See if you have a budget. I know if you're like me, you may not have one. There will sometimes be stipends that are given to you. Sometimes you will just money will sometimes come. And so be looking at different ways that you can get instruments, or what do you need in that moment? And each year focus on what you want. Then the next year focus on what else do you need? Or actually it's want and need. What do you want and what do you need? Let's put it both ways. And then each year you're going to slowly build it up. Slowly build it up. Slowly build it up. So don't focus on getting it all right now, but focus on planning for the future. Think about ways you can acquire these instruments. Is it writing a grant? Will your PTO or PTA, whatever it's called where you live, will they help you out in purchasing instruments? Are you given a budget that you can use towards the instruments? So don't focus on getting everything at once, but like I said, break it down year by year. Think about what you need first and then start there. I hope this episode encourages you more than anything that you're not alone if you find yourself teaching without a lot of instruments, that you still are an effective music teacher, even if you don't have a lot of the things, the stuff. The stuff is just, in my opinion, a bonus because you using your personality and your amazing skill set and you teaching your students creatively, even if you don't have a lot of things, that is what is needed in the music room more than anything. The instruments is just an added benefit. And so don't let that stop you from continuing to teach music to your students if you find yourself without a lot of resources. You're doing an amazing job, friend, and keep pushing forward because your students need the gift of music and they need you as the music teacher. Have an amazing week, friends, and I'll be back soon. Well, hey there. Thank you so much for listening into the Elementary Music Teacher podcast. There is an exclusive Facebook group just for listeners of this podcast and any elementary music teacher called the Elementary Music Teacher Community Facebook group. Come on over and join us there where we have conversations around the podcast episodes and encourage each other each and every week. And also head to my website, thedomesticmusician.com. I have some free resources there that you can download to help you gain traction in your classroom today, as well as the blog and the membership site and all kinds of other goodies to help you keep going in your music teaching journey. I cannot wait to keep connecting with you and encouraging you and spurring you on in your journey of teaching elementary music. Hang in there, have an amazing week, and I will see you soon.